Today I'd like to kind of delve into the objectification of experience and the difference between the way we often experience life as a noun or things as a thing rather than life as a verb. I mean, that maybe sounds a little simple to say it that way, but we tend to think of things as static. You're you, and the chair, the couch is the couch, and things are things, and they more or less stay the same, versus looking at life as always in changing, always in flux as a verb, rather than that nothing is really static, nothing actually stays the same. And this objectification has kind of been influenced by physics, by science, up until recently. And now science is beginning to discover through subatomic particles and the newer physics is beginning to really question whether there's things are objective rather than influenced by our perception, and whether even our perception is really showing us what's real. So I got into this myself. I was having an LSD experience when I was meditating, and the meditation I practice is like sort of sensing into the moment, not concentrating on the breath or concentrating on anything, but just this kind of opening awareness. And this particular time, being on LSD and meditating, I began to experience that as I was attending in the moment to awareness, the attention kind of started branching out. It wasn't static, but it was sort of like the attention was growing more attention and more attention, like you might imagine a tree growing or a plant growing, only it was happening rather quickly. It was sort of attention was compounding and creating more awareness, and from that more awareness, and it was somewhat of a unique experience at that time. So it was a great experience, and it also got me interested in systems theory and systems thinking, and kind of wondering how are other people kind of understanding our experience in that kind of way. And so I found a couple of scientists who were talking about this kind of thing, that it fits into this theme of the experience was one of not of a static, but one of a not only a changing, but kind of this growthful, more and more deepening of awareness and deepening of the branches of awareness, so to speak. And so I began looking into that, and I found a couple of scientists who were kind of putting forth some new ideas about the nature of the universe. One is a man named Neil Thies, and he was one of the pioneers in stem cell research some time ago, and he's continuing to do science, and he's looking at how the world is in flux all the time, that what we take to be an object is just our perception of it, but that actually things are always changing and evolving, and systems are becoming more and more aware in a more larger capacity. And so, for example, he says that at a distance you might see some starlings at a far distance, and that looks like an object. But when you look up close, you see there are all these birds that are moving together in some way that is changing. And he gives a number of examples of this. So he talks about self-organizing systems, which is nothing new. It's been studied for some time now, and we have more and more knowledge about it in these systems in the last 30, 40 years. That self-organizing systems need a large degree of certainty, but if they're too certain, then they become kind of stuck. But they also need some chaos in order to be growing and evolving. Another sort of scientific pioneer is a person who studies perception, and he concludes that, this is talking about the objective universe as we think of it, that we don't really perceive objects as they really are. This is, again, not a new idea. There's a philosopher named Kant, Immanuel Kant, that put forth this idea in a somewhat different way, and other philosophers. But he's studying perception more in a scientific way, and he says that evolution leads us to perceive not what's real, but what is functional in terms of us being able to reproduce and to carry on our species. And so what we see and what we experience is, rather than truth, is what works in order for us to be able to function and be successful and live and survive in the world and reproduce. And he says his view is that what we experience as, we think of as reality, is kind of like when you are on a computer and you look at the icons on the computer, the Gmail icon or the Facebook icon, whatever, and that's what you see, and that's what you interface with, and but you don't see the underlying the program. You don't see the electronics, all that's making that symbol there easy for you to use and manipulate. And he says that our perceptions of the world are like that. The things we see, the things that we take to be objects, to be fixed, are like icons, and we don't really see the reality at all. And so these are scientists who are beginning to talk about that there's a reality that's within or deeper than our usual awareness. And they go further and talk about the whole question of whether consciousness is primary rather than an evolution of the material world. I won't go into that now. And so I'm trying to talk about objectification and subject-object experiences. And so to carry that further into our everyday life, we believe that objects, and I mean by objects something that's separate from us, including people, and using it in that way, people, situations, when my favorite baseball team wins, when things bring us happiness, we think that happiness comes from our relationship to objects, and then because we tend to think of objects as permanent, we tend to think, well, I'll be happy forever as long as I'm with this person, or I'll be happy forever with this or that or whatever it might be. And so again, we don't acknowledge how things are always in flux, and we're changing, and the object that we wish to think is going to bring us happiness is changing. And so it turns out that we do get happiness sometimes with the object that we desire, but it's very mixed, because it brings us probably as much unhappiness, the relationship with the object, as much unhappiness when it changes or we lose it. Something I really valued, and I had for when I played softball, I had my favorite drinking mug, like that keeps my water cold, and I left it there, and I was so happy with it until I lost it, but that's a minor thing. But for small and big things, we find our experience again and again is that yes, I'm happy when I have what I want, but then when it turns out not to be what I want, or I lose it, or I change, or it changes, then I'm just as upset perhaps as I was happy. And now this isn't anything new. The spiritual traditions have talked about this in various traditions, and it's interesting in terms of the creation myths. We have the creation myth in the Old Testament of Adam and Eve, and how they were in the Garden of Eden and they had everything they needed, and then of course the woman was tempted, and blame it on the women, right? Was tempted by the apple from the serpent, and they lost that innocence. And so God was separate from them, and it was the human beings that were tempted. In the creation myth in the Puranas in India, which is described by Joseph Campbell in some detail, the creator god, Brahma, is in the midst of creating the whole universe, bit by bit. And then he creates this woman, Dawn. Dawn, you can think of dawn as the dawn that we experience, but in the personification of this beautiful, enticing woman. And he becomes smitten with her. His own creation. Now it's an object for him to want to possess and want to be with, and he becomes in the Greek myth, what's the god that of love, Cupid? There's a similar god, Kama, in the Indian myth, who shoots arrows into Brahma, the creator, that makes him fall in love with his creation. And so this is how the world begins. It's a story again of the creator himself, in this case a himself, adoring and falling and being attached to the object of his creation. And so from this point of view then, all of our pleasure and pain and our living in the world comes out of this kind of objectification and thinking that what will make us happy is somehow outside, and then gaining and losing that, and so we're caught in this. And I was talking about my favorite baseball team. So sports are really interesting. People often have a favorite team. And when the team wins, they're all enthused and happy, and when it loses, they're down or dejected, and so it's always a balance. Maybe we can game the system and pay a lot of money for better players, and our team will win 60% of the time. We'll be happier than we're down, and then they'll win in the end, and we'll be really happy this year, but 2 years from now, when we lose our great quarterback, so-called, then we're down in the dumps again. So this is the way the world goes round. So there's another way to think about that, and the spiritual traditions have talked about this problem, if we can call it that, and this source of suffering as well as happiness, and what do we do about that? And one way to see that is that what we think of as seeking joy or pleasure or fulfillment is actually putting boundaries up. It's my team, it's this person, it's this fancy sports car, that's giving me pleasure. So we put a boundary up, and it's this particular object or these particular objects or these particular accomplishments. It's not just an object, it might be an accomplishment, is what is giving me pleasure. So rather than just feeling the fulfillment that comes from within, we're actually putting boundaries up and making only a particular thing or a few things the source of our satisfaction. And we're not allowing the flow of being in the present. We're going after the object and being afraid to lose it or trying to attain it. And so we're in the past and the future and not in the moment. And so from what I'm trying to share, from this sense that things are always in flux, and it's not the object that gives us pleasure, it's our taking our desire or our sense of what feels good and somehow making it seem like it's the object that's making us feel good. And so when we begin to turn inward and begin to turn inside and be in the moment, we begin to discover that happiness, joy, fulfillment is already here within us. And we're just taking that inner fulfillment, inner happiness, and putting it onto something as though we projected our energy onto that, and then we think that's carrying it. So meditation is the one way that we can turn inward and begin to feel that already wonderful sense of happiness and fulfillment that's already here. Psychedelics are another way that bring us into that awareness. So the difficulty that creates problems for us are not the objects themselves. It's really our beliefs about the objects. Or we might say that beliefs are another way that we take the world to be a noun, a something, rather than in process. And so I want to focus more about beliefs. It's not the objects, it's how we regard them that's the issue. And so some of our beliefs that I've talked about is that the things that we are going after and want and may finally have will last forever. And that they're the source of our joy. We believe that. And so I wanted to look more into beliefs, and so many of us defend our beliefs. We think our beliefs are the correct ones, and whether on a very liberal beliefs or very conservative beliefs, whoever believes that thinks that their beliefs are right, and obviously right. There's no question about that. And so we defend our beliefs as though they're important and they're right and they're real. And this has gone on. We have that happening now, and we have that happening historically. There were beliefs at a time that the Earth was flat, and then later there was the belief that and there was also the belief that the Earth is the center of the universe. Our beliefs tend to be egocentric. They put ourselves at the center in one way or another. And then Galileo in the 1600s, he, through his observations of astronomy, discovered that the Earth wasn't the center, that the Earth revolved around the sun. And because the beliefs were so strong at that time, the Catholic Church had his books, his writings banned. They put him under arrest for the last 20 years of his life. They didn't, this is during the time of the Inquisition. They didn't burn him or kill him, but they had him under arrest for his life for challenging these beliefs. And so we see that again and again. Even, I think even the psychedelic reaction to psychedelics and the making the psychedelics illegal was in part because they challenged not only the structure and customs of society, but and the beliefs of society. They challenged them to such a degree that they, at that time, they weren't able to be integrated into society. Einstein was an interesting human being in many ways, but in terms of this, he was interesting in that when he was a student studying physics at universities in Germany, his professors had certain beliefs, and they also thought this is the truth, and here's the way that you should find this. Here's the sort of the procedure of reasoning in order to find this formula, for example. And Einstein, he just had his own way. He wouldn't follow he wouldn't do, the prescribed ways of doing things. He'd find his own way, and he'd come up with the same truth or the same formula while he was a student, but he did it in his own way. And so his professors, they didn't like that. They thought he was, put him down. They said negative things about him. And then when he graduated, while the other students in his class got assistant professors or jobs here and there, they wouldn't recommend him for a job. Not because he was wrong or stupid, but because he just had his own way and didn't follow along with the beliefs and the procedures that were there at the time. So beliefs have a certain value, like Newtonian physics allowed us to develop mechanics and machines and all kinds of had all kinds of benefits. But eventually, any belief will turn out to be limiting. Even Einstein's views these days are seen by some as having limitations. As amazing as his insights have been. So any belief sets up a limited view of the world. Even Pythagoras, the great geometer, his way of developing geometry from one single belief, that the definition of parallel lines, just started with that. Two lines that never meet are parallel lines. And from that, he built up his whole geometry from that belief system. It's pretty amazing. But at the same time now, in I don't know when, in the 1700s, I'm not sure when, people began to ask, who were mathematicians, what about a different definition of parallel lines? What about parallel lines are two lines that meet in infinity? And a whole different geometry developed out of that initial belief, our starting point. So beliefs are always they can be helpful, but they have a limited way of understanding ourselves or the world. Now, everything I've been saying, I've been generating a lot of beliefs. If you think about my talk so far, right? Do you believe what I said? I believe it. So how am I just being one more person here that's giving in some new beliefs or familiar beliefs or a variation of things you've already believed? Are we just Is that just how we're kind of destined to be? I mean, what else can we do beside be living in beliefs? Is there another way? Is it possible to forego all beliefs and live in wonder? Is that possible? So another way that we might explore and has been put forth is to be questioning all the time. Doesn't mean being skeptical, it means just questioning, just asking, rather than asserting, just asking, what is this? What am I feeling? What are you doing? What is going on? Whatever, we can explore that further, but what would it be like to live in questioning? So there was a famous poet, am I saying his name right? Rainer Maria Rilke. He, in one of his famous quotes was in something he wrote called Letters to a Young Poet. He says, "Live in the questions now. Perhaps someday, far in the future, you'll gradually, without realizing it, live your way into the answer." And so this kind of approach of questioning was of interest to Rilke. It's also been historically an approach in some spiritual traditions. There's a tradition called self-inquiry in the non-dualism, in the Vedantic tradition. There's an approach called self-inquiry, just inquiring, what is this? What's the nature of reality? What is this? Without necessarily, in some approaches there may be some beliefs involved, but if pure self-inquiry is just asking. When in the non-dual traditions of India, there's also an approach called neti neti. Rather than defining what is God, what is consciousness, what is this, that whatever you come up with, it's not this and not this. Whatever conception you have, it's not that. So that's another practice of exploring that's very traditional. How many people are doing it, I don't know, but it's in the scriptures of India, this practice of not this and not this, of not taking on any conception of, but living in the non-conceptual being. Is that sun okay in your eyes? So can we live without reaching a conclusion? So there's an interesting woman named Byron Katie. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. Anybody have heard of her? She has one of her books is Loving What Is. And she's a woman who claims to have reached some higher state of consciousness at some point in her life and has a practice of questioning. When she works with somebody, I thought I brought in I was going to quote something. She asked some questions. Here's one belief at a time worksheet. She has worksheets and she has a system. So when someone comes with a belief, I feel I'm not good enough. I feel like I just don't feel I'm good enough, or whatever might come to her as something that's causing them emotional distress. She would start with that belief that they bring forward, and she would say, well, is it true? Can you absolutely know it's true? She would just ask the questions. How do you react when you believe that thought? And then, so she would ask the person to describe how that thought affects them and write down kind of write down all their responses to inquiring into that thought and whether it's true or not. And then she says, now can you turn it around? I'm not good enough. Well, what would be a turnaround? You're not good enough? If it's about a relationship, I'm not as good as you. Let's say it that way. I'm not as good as you. Turn it around. You're not as good as me. Well, what's it like to explore that thought? Or neither of us are good enough. Or we're both good enough. Or to find turnarounds of all different kinds and to sort of loosen up the identification with that belief system. So she has a whole process of working in that way, and I find it's helpful. I've had clients of mine that I've sometimes introduced them to that, and they've worked with that, and it's been helpful to disidentify with their limited beliefs. But with time, I've come to feel that it's also overly complex. It's overly a lot of work to do, and might it not be simpler just to understand that any thoughts or any beliefs are just beliefs and thoughts, that I'm not those beliefs and thoughts, they're just beliefs, they're just thoughts. Now, intellectually, just to say that is not very helpful. That's just another belief. They're just thoughts as another belief. But what if we can open to another way of being that's distinct from those thoughts, and then we can see them as they're just beliefs rather than having a belief about it. So I'm introducing the idea that one way we can disidentify with beliefs is through living in questioning. And I'm kind of talking about different ways that people might approach that. One is Byron Katie's method for doing that. Another is another is a teacher I've studied with that I've mentioned before. His name was David Grove, who grew up in the Maori world in New Zealand, and then was educated in the West, and then developed a way of doing therapy which simply asks questions, doesn't interpret anything, just asking questions. And so I've studied and learned some of that. And one of the ways he asks questions is to, a person comes in and says, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I feel bad. Now, and I've said this before, a Rogerian therapist back in the day who tried to have unconditional regard for his client might say, yeah, you're down in the dumps, I can see that. And he would change the wording around, and he'd try to be empathic, but he shifted, and so the client wasn't really connecting with his own words and his own experience with the therapist. And so in David Grove's work, he would just ask, when you feel down in the dumps, or when you feel sad or depressed, when you feel depressed, he'd take whatever the word the client would use, and whereabouts is depressed? Is it on the inside or the outside? Oh, it's in my stomach, I feel this sadness, and my shoulders are bent over, and then he'd ask, and what's that like when you feel that? And he said, it's like being in the bottom of a well or something, whatever. And what kind of well is that? And does it have a color or shape, and how deep is it? And so the person would he would use metaphor, the person's own metaphors. It wouldn't be like, a guided visualization. Imagine you're on a beach and this and this. follow just exactly the words of the client, and eventually it might lead to the client kind of regressing into being like a child, speaking from a younger child who's depressed. The whole demeanor of the person would change and begin to work with that metaphor. And he would say that people were stuck in the moment before a trauma, and they stuck back there, and for their life. And he would take them back to that through the metaphor, to that moment before the trauma. And because it was a metaphor, it wouldn't be like re-traumatizing the person. And he would then, through their own metaphor, without him sort of directing, he didn't try to, the metaphor would kind of evolve naturally to lead that person through that stuck place. And the metaphor would eventually come out to, and there's sunlight and grass and so on. And this would happen again and again. I've done this worked with this with people, and it's interesting. It's fascinating how often the metaphor work will lead into this very benign experience just on its own without being guided. So that's another way of just asking questions and using what he called clean language, and I've mentioned this before. He would say that most therapists commit adultery, meaning by what he meant was that they are speaking to the adult and using concepts and interpretations rather than just being there in the moment with this clean language and speaking to the child that's also present. So I have to get that off of the video.
We'll cut that out in post.
I'm just kidding. So this sounds pretty radical. What is it like to live in wonder, to live in the question, and not be coming to conclusions or living in beliefs or conclusions as a result of that wonder. So another more direct way is just not taking the mind seriously. And sometimes another way that I've explored this, I think it's important to differentiate therapy or whether it's therapy or people who are working on themselves, who are trying to get to a better place that they think is a better place of more happiness, less anxiety. If I do this, I'll be happier. If I follow this program or this approach, which I call a self-improvement approach to life, versus what I consider more of a self-acceptance way of approaching our life, accepting all that we are, rather than thinking, if I get rid of my annoyance that comes up all the time, if I get rid of this or I get more of this, I'll be a better person. There's two very different ways of being. There's an interesting woman who, I didn't bring the book. I don't have the title, I can get it. There's a woman who, for many years, I'm going to pause a minute, I'm going to pull up the shades so we can have some light, and I'll get that book. I think we could use some light here. Trying to lift the shades one at a time. So this is a book called Collision with the Infinite. I think I told you a little bit about it. I don't know if anybody's read it. It's not that well known. So this is a woman, for years some years she had practiced transcendental meditation, and she'd done some of the more advanced classes. And then she left that. She found it was getting kind of weird. People were hopping around and stuff like that. So, and then she was just living her life. And one day she was at a bus stop, and suddenly she couldn't find herself. Like her self disappeared. Her sense of this is me just disappeared. Not through any practice she was doing. It just was gone. And she got scared. She didn't know what this was. And so she became very fearful. Am I going crazy? How can I live if I don't have a self? How can I function, you know? But she couldn't find a self anywhere. And so she became very afraid. And she couldn't sleep at night. She was so fearful of what this was happening to her. Was she going psychotic, or what's going on? And for 10 years, she was just living in fear. And she'd go to therapists. She probably went to a dozen therapists over time. People who were recommended to her, and they diagnosed her with some kind of dissociative disorder, or this or that, or try to get her to, have a self or change, or each one would have a different approach, but none of them were successful. And then after about 10 years, she began to look towards some spiritual teachers, some teachers who were, especially teachers of non-dualism. She went to see Gangaji, Jean Klein, some of the teachers that I've gone to, and had talks with them, met personally with them, and they began to tell her that this was a wonderful thing to not have a self, that she was, really, the only problem was that she was in the belief of her mind that this was something to be afraid of, and that was taking her over. And if she simply let go of that belief, then there'd be no problem, that she began to feel the wonderful feeling of not having a self. And so it took her some time, and gradually her whole experience shifted by simply not identifying with the thought in the mind, the belief in the mind that something is wrong with me and it needs to be fixed, and this is terrible and I can't function this way. And she found that she could function perfectly fine without a self, without thinking, I'm doing this, that the doing came from some deeper place within, and she was still doing all the things an ordinary person does, but not with the goal from the individual self. And so her book describes that experience of and how one can function in the world without beliefs, which is something we might wonder, is that really possible to function without having a belief in that this is who I am? And so when we let go of our reliance on objects, that also happens. In her case, it happened very quickly. Her sense of self dissolved. But if there are no objects to be identified with, then there's no subjects. And I've talked about Franklin Merrill Wolff, who had these steps in evolving into a greater and greater awareness, where he talked about the philosophy of consciousness without an object. And he says that then he also began to experience the loss of a subject, and was in this pure consciousness that was beyond subject and object. And So all these therapists that she went to were all still in this mode of let me just read a little bit from her. In this mode of, there's something wrong with you, we need to give you medication, we need to fix it, we need to figure out what to do about what's wrong with you. She says, the pathologizing of human experience, which has been perpetrated by the over-psychologizing of our culture, is another horror that has been masquerading as truth. We have been psychologized into believing that only certain experiences are appropriate. We've been given words that label our experience and thereby put us into an aversive relationship to our experience. The vastness, which is what she calls this state of non-self, is rigorously non-pathologizing because it is unable to perceive anything as wrong. It is absurd to think that we can get rid of certain aspects of our experience to be acceptable. So this other way of, rather than self-improvement, this way of self-acceptance is non-pathologizing. It's regarding whatever is as just an aspect of who we are that's showing up. And that if we invite that aspect, if we just allow it to be, if we don't judge it, if we come from not a belief about it, but just a inquisitive wondering what is this? Not wondering like conceptually, oh, I'm going to figure out what this is, but wondering in a way that we allow it to be, we feel into it, we discover it, we have a relationship with it that's not a conceptual, a separated relationship, but one that's inviting and including. And so, and there were a couple of therapists that she went to later who were part of this non-dual tradition that were also helpful, that were emphasizing self-acceptance, not as a thing to do, not as, and that would be another kind of goal. If I were more self-accepting, I would be better. But to come to that place in us that is already non-judgmental and all-inclusive. So I better say something about psychedelics for whoever's here that's interested. I'm not going to point out you, but
I think about way other things too.
do without that. But let me just say, so at least briefly, I'm teasing you about it. See, I'm not picking on you, I'm picking on her today. I went to, there was a group up in the Dells, and they have this store, a restaurant called the Cheese Factory. You've been there? It's a vegetarian restaurant, really good restaurant. But it was a group, and there was a guy there called the Master Teacher. And he had his own tradition. I'm not sure what other tradition, a bigger tradition he was part of, but he had his own followers. And they had a service on Sunday. I wanted to go up and see what it was like. It was in a church, but this was not affiliated with any religion. And so this master teacher was speaking, and I was in the audience, and he kind of focused on me. And he said, "You're here to write about me. You don't really believe, you don't trust what I'm saying." And he was just, really being very, very attacking verbally. And the people around me in this group were saying, "This is great, when he does this, he really cares about somebody." I'm in this, well, You know, I wanted to just say, you're an idiot and stand up but I knew that if I did that, there was all his followers and, you know, he was going to find a way to say, see, you're just a troublemaker, you know, so I didn't find a space to do that. So talking about picking on people, I'm pretty benign, right? And then I was in it was in Thailand, and went to a group, it was maybe a dozen people, outdoor space, that they were the followers of this man from Germany. I don't know his name. And he was supposed to be this non-dual teacher and very inspired. And all he would do is criticize the people there. He'd put them down, and again, I wanted to stand up and say, and I was a Swami then, you don't know, you know, but I felt again it would be just, it wouldn't work in that situation, or maybe any situation. But it was just astounding to me that these people would follow him from Germany and go to Thailand, and all he would do was just castigate him and say, you don't know how to practice, and you're not, you know, just all this negativity. It was really something to see. So that aside, so psychedelics also open us to non-conceptual being, toward presence, toward you know, even people who think psychedelics are about seeing all these colors and shapes and so on. And there are many people that are disappointed if they take LSD and they don't see shapes and colors. You know, even that though is taking us from the static, from the objective, this is a thing, into seeing the dynamics and the interaction, and to see that the sense of us as a separate thing or being is not genuine. To see that everything is all connected and everything is moving, whether we see it visually or we feel it inside. To see that these boundaries that we have imagined between ourselves and others, or between various aspects of the world, are not, they're just illusionary. They're just surface interpretations and customs, and that they don't have any basis beyond kind of the veneer of life. Now, it's also possible out of any direct experience, of any experience that takes us into a sense of oneness, to then kind of come back and interpret it in a certain way, and then to get stuck in beliefs about what we experienced, or beliefs about, you know, any spiritual tradition, any religious tradition, you know, started out with some experience of oneness, but then as the followers began to develop ways of practice and so on, often then that wonder was lost, and it became all about believing this, and my beliefs are better than this other group's beliefs, and theirs are wrong and mine's right, and if I get them to believe what I believe, then things will be okay, so I'm going to go attack them and make them believe what I believe. So what I'm saying is, any revelatory experience, the mind tends to then want to come over and concretize that and make it into a belief system, and then lose then that sense of wonder is lost. So the question then would be, for me, how do we keep that sense of wonder, being in wonder, not just when we take a substance or in some special revelation, but how do we live a life that's where we don't take our thoughts seriously, but we kind of wonder. I love that term, wonder, you know, because it's like it captures how wonderful that sense feels of being in wonder, and it also expresses this this kind of wondering, this sense of discovering rather than knowing. And so other teachers, like Jean Klein, used to talk about living in the question too, rather than thinking we know the answer. Well, I think we'll stop with that for now. And what's a good way to end? I haven't found a good way to end. Okay, but that's it. The end of this talking.